Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Appalachian Mountains are a place of deep roots and ancient mysteries, where the veil between the known and the unknown feels thin. These are 9 documented encounters from that vast, shadowed landscape. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was the spring of 2000 when communications technician James Reynolds was assigned to upgrade the emergency radio repeater on Pine Mountain in eastern Kentucky. The 42-year-old father of 2 had worked for Bell Communications for 15 years and was well-versed in the peculiarities of servicing equipment in remote locations. The repeater station, positioned at an elevation of 2,400 feet, was accessible only by a treacherous dirt road that wound its way up the mountain's spine. Reynolds planned to complete the work in 3 days, camping near the station to maximize his efficiency. The spring weather had been unseasonably dry, making the drive to the isolated site easier than he had anticipated. On the first evening, after completing the initial diagnostics on the aging equipment, Reynolds was eating a simple dinner of canned chili when his spectrum analyzer, left running on a workbench, emitted a soft beep. He glanced over and saw an anomalous signal on the display. The frequency, 462.675 MHz, was within the GMRS band, but didn't correspond to any licensed transmitter in the area. What struck Reynolds as professionally curious was the signal's pattern. 3 distinct pulses, followed by a precise 3-second silence, then 3 more pulses, repeating in an endless mechanical loop. The signal was strong and clear, suggesting a nearby transmitter, not a distant bleed-through. He spent the next hour trying to identify its source, even driving his truck along the access road to different elevations in an attempt to triangulate its origin. His calculations pointed to a location approximately 2 miles northeast of his position, in an area of steep, uninhabited woodland with no recorded communications equipment. The following morning, Reynolds contacted his supervisor, Frank Miller, back in Lexington, to report the anomalous signal. Miller, a veteran engineer with decades of experience in the region, suggested it was likely an illegal repeater set up by local hunters or survivalists. He advised Reynolds to document the frequency and pattern, but to focus on his assigned work. Reynolds spent the day replacing the aging antenna cables and power supplies at the repeater station, periodically checking the signal on his analyzer. The pattern remained unchanged throughout the day. 3 pulses, 3 seconds of silence, 3 more pulses. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, Reynolds noticed something that made the hair on his arms stand up. The signal was now approximately 2 decibels stronger, despite no change in atmospheric conditions that would typically affect VHF propagation. That night, Reynolds was awakened by his satellite phone ringing insistently at 2:17 a.m. It was Miller, calling from his home over 100 miles away. "Jim, are you transmitting on any unusual frequencies?" Miller asked, his voice tight with concern. Reynolds explained that he was only using his test equipment and hadn't transmitted anything since their conversation the previous morning. Miller then revealed something that elevated the situation from a minor curiosity to a genuine anomaly. The signal Reynolds had detected was being picked up by repeaters across 3 states, with amateur radio operators in Virginia and West Virginia reporting the same strange, repeating pattern. What's more, several experienced operators had reported that the signal seemed to be moving, though none could pinpoint its location with any accuracy. Miller advised Reynolds to secure his equipment and remain inside his truck until morning. Reynolds spent a restless night in the cab of his truck, periodically checking the signal on his handheld spectrum analyzer. The mountain air was cold, and the silence outside was broken only by the wind whispering through the pines. At approximately 4:30 a.m., he noticed a subtle but undeniable change in the signal's pattern. Now it was 4 pulses, a pause of 2 seconds, then 4 more pulses. The signal's strength also began to fluctuate dramatically, swinging by 10 or more decibels at a time, suggesting a mobile transmitter moving through varied terrain. As the first gray light of dawn appeared, Reynolds packed his equipment with a speed that bordered on panic, abandoning his plan to stay a 3rd day. During his tense drive down the mountain, he stopped at a scenic overlook to make one final check. The signal was gone. He contacted Miller from his truck to report its disappearance. By the time Reynolds reached the highway, Miller called back to inform him that the signal had vanished from all monitoring stations simultaneously at 6:47 a.m. The FCC investigated the incident, opening case file 2008-0472 on May 15, 2008. Their final report concluded that the signal likely originated from an illegal transmitter operated by unknown individuals. However, the report noted that the signal's power and propagation characteristics were inconsistent with typical portable or mobile equipment. No source was ever identified, and no further signals of this nature have been reported from the region. Reynolds transferred to a desk position later that year, citing a desire to spend more time with his family. He rarely discusses his experience on Pine Mountain, but in a 2015 interview with an amateur radio magazine, he stated, "I've worked with radio signals my entire adult life, and I can tell you with certainty that whatever was transmitting that night wasn't using conventional technology. The pattern was too precise, the power too consistent, and the disappearance too complete." The Pine Mountain incident remains one of the most thoroughly documented yet unexplained signal anomalies in FCC records. It was October 22, 2016, when 24-year-old Sarah Hayes set out on a solo hiking trip in the Monongahela National Forest of West Virginia. The graduate student in anthropology was conducting research for her thesis on Appalachian folklore and had planned a 3-day trek through the remote Dolly Sods wilderness area. Hayes was an experienced hiker who had grown up in the region, familiar with both its profound beauty and its potential dangers. She left a detailed itinerary with her roommate, checked in with rangers at the trailhead, and carried sufficient supplies for her journey. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and mild temperatures. Perfect conditions for autumn hiking in the mountains. Hayes' last known contact was at 6:15 p.m. on her first day, when she sent a text message to her roommate. "Reached the overlook at Breathed Mountain, absolutely breathtaking, setting up camp now." The message included a photograph showing a panoramic view of the valley below, shrouded in the soft purple haze of twilight, with Hayes' orange tent visible in the foreground. When her roommate tried calling her phone the next morning, it went directly to voicemail. Initially unconcerned, cell service was notoriously unreliable in the area. She didn't report Hayes as missing until October 24th, when Hayes failed to return to their apartment in Morgantown as scheduled. The Preston County Sheriff's Department logged the missing person report at 7:32 p.m. and initiated a search the following morning. The search effort involved over 100 volunteers from 12 different organizations, coordinated by the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. Search teams followed Hayes' planned route, discovering her campsite at Breathed Mountain on October 25th. The tent was still standing, though the entrance flap was open, billowing gently in the breeze. Inside, searchers found Hayes' backpack, sleeping bag, and personal belongings, including her wallet, phone charger, and research notes. Her phone and camera were missing. Of particular interest to investigators was her journal, which contained entries up until the evening of October 22nd. The final entry read, "Heard what sounded like a woman crying in the distance. Probably just the wind, but it's been following me for the last hour. Will keep my fire going tonight." Search teams expanded their radius, covering more than 50 square miles of rugged terrain over the next 10 days. On November 3rd, a team discovered Hayes' phone approximately 2 miles from her campsite, near the edge of a rocky outcropping known locally as the Devil's Backbone. The phone's battery was dead, but forensic analysis later revealed that its last activity had been at 3:17 a.m. on October 23rd, a failed attempt to call 911. The camera was never found. Search dogs tracked Hayes' scent from her campsite to the location where her phone was discovered, but lost the trail at that point. No other signs of Hayes were found despite extensive searching that continued through the winter. The investigation into Hayes' disappearance took an unusual turn on December 12th, when her camera was mailed anonymously to the Preston County Sheriff's Department. The package, wrapped in plain brown paper, had no return address and was postmarked from a town over 200 miles from the search area. The camera's memory card contained all the photos Hayes had taken during her trip, including several from the morning of October 23rd that showed unusual footprints in the mud near her tent. The prints were longer and narrower than a human foot, with what appeared to be only 4 toes. The final photo on the card, time-stamped at 3:14 a.m., showed a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees beyond Hayes' tent. The image was blurry, but clearly depicted something tall and thin, with proportions that didn't match any known animal or human. The FBI joined the investigation in January 2017, but no additional evidence was uncovered. Hayes' case was transferred to cold case status in December 2018, with investigators noting that foul play could not be ruled out, but no definitive evidence of it had been found. Her disappearance has since become part of the folklore she had been studying, with some locals suggesting she encountered the same woman of the woods whose stories she had been documenting. The Monongahela National Forest maintains a missing person alert for Hayes, and her family continues to offer a reward for information leading to her whereabouts. The anonymous mailing of her camera remains unexplained, as does the final photograph on the memory card. Sarah Hayes was never seen again, leaving behind only questions and a chilling final image that defies easy explanation. It was the summer of 1972 when construction foreman Raymond Thompson first encountered something inexplicable in the newly excavated railroad tunnel near Blacksville, West Virginia. The 48-year-old Vietnam veteran had overseen dozens of similar projects for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and considered himself immune to the superstitions that often circulated among his crew. The tunnel, designated Section 7B in company documents, was being bored through Piney Mountain to eliminate a treacherous curve on the main line. The work had progressed smoothly since breaking ground in March, with the excavation reaching approximately 800 feet into the mountain by late June. The first incident occurred on July 11th during the night shift. Thompson was reviewing progress reports in his temporary office when he heard what sounded like rhythmic tapping coming from deep inside the tunnel. He assumed it was a crew member testing the rock face with a pickaxe. But when he went to investigate, he found the tunnel empty except for the idle machinery. The tapping stopped as he entered, then resumed after he left. Thompson dismissed it as an echo from machinery cooling down, though he noted in his daily log that the sound seemed to follow a pattern. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more taps. The following night, 2 workers independently reported hearing what they described as whispering when they were near the tunnel face. Thompson reprimanded them for what he considered attempts to frighten newer crew members. On July 15th, A drill operator named Samuel Patterson claimed his machine had shut down inexplicably, despite having a full fuel tank and no mechanical issues. When Patterson attempted to restart it, he reported hearing a voice say, "Get out," from the speaker of the two-way radio built into the machine's cab. The radio was turned off at the time. Thompson documented the incident, but attributed it to equipment malfunction and operator fatigue. The following day, Patterson quit, telling Thompson, "I've seen things in Vietnam that would make most men run, but whatever's in that tunnel scares me more." Thompson replaced him and continued the work, though he privately noted the unusual frequency of equipment malfunctions and strange reports. The situation escalated on July 19th, when a partial collapse occurred near the tunnel face. No workers were injured, but the incident halted progress for 3 days while engineers assessed the structural integrity. During the inspection, they discovered something unusual. The collapse had revealed a small cavity in the rock wall, approximately 3 feet in diameter, containing what appeared to be primitive tools and fragments of pottery. The company archaeologist who examined the findings dated them to the late Archaic period, 3000 to 1000 BCE, noting that such artifacts were rarely found so deep underground. Thompson ordered the cavity sealed and the work to continue, though several workers expressed unease about continuing after what they considered a desecration of an ancient burial site. The most disturbing incident occurred on July 28th. Thompson was conducting a final inspection before the end of his shift when he noticed a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel near the excavation face. He called out, but the figure didn't respond. As he approached, Thompson realized the figure was unnaturally tall and thin, with proportions that seemed wrong even in the dim lighting. When he was about 50 feet away, the figure turned and walked into the rock wall, disappearing as if it were an open doorway. Thompson rushed to the spot, finding only solid rock with no indication of any passage. He documented the experience in his private journal, but made no official report, fearing ridicule and the loss of his position. Thompson requested a transfer the following week, citing health reasons. The tunnel project was completed in November 1972 without further incidents, though several workers quit during the final months of construction. The tunnel has been in continuous operation since 1973, with train crews occasionally reporting unusual phenomena: flickering lights, unexplained sounds, and occasional sightings of a tall figure near the north entrance. In 1998, a maintenance crew discovered a small fissure in the tunnel wall, approximately where Thompson had seen the figure disappear. Inside, they found artifacts similar to those discovered in 1972, along with what appeared to be more recent items, including a railroad spike dated 1923. 20 years before the tunnel was constructed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's official records make no mention of unusual incidents during the tunnel's construction, and Thompson never spoke publicly about his experiences. He retired in 1985 and moved to Arizona, where he lived until his death in 2003. The Blacksville Tunnel remains in use today, carrying freight and passenger trains through Piney Mountain, while whatever Thompson encountered that July remains buried in the official silence of company records and the private fears of those who work there. It was March 2003 when Park Ranger Maria Rodriguez first observed the mysterious lights over Greene County, Tennessee. The 29-year-old had worked at the Cherokee National Forest for 3 years and was familiar with most natural phenomena that could be mistaken for something unusual. The lights appeared first as distant glimmers in the night sky, visible from the fire tower on Max Patch Mountain where Rodriguez was stationed during the spring fire watch season. At first, she dismissed them as aircraft lights or perhaps reflections from the distant town of Hot Springs, North Carolina, visible across the valley on clear nights. The lights returned on 3 consecutive nights, always appearing between 10:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. Unlike aircraft, they remained stationary for extended periods, sometimes hovering motionless for over an hour before moving slowly in what appeared to be a triangular formation. Rodriguez began documenting the appearances, noting times, positions, and characteristics. On March 17th, she invited her supervisor, 45-year-old Ranger David Chen, to observe the phenomenon with her. Chen, a skeptical 20-year veteran of the Forest Service, initially suggested they were military flares from the nearby National Guard training area, though he acknowledged the timing and patterns didn't match typical exercises. The most compelling observation occurred on March 21st. Using a high-powered spotting scope, Rodriguez and Chen watched as one of the lights descended slowly toward the forest floor, approximately 3 miles from their position. As it neared the ground, the light illuminated a clearing with an intensity that Chen later described as brighter than daylight, but without heat. Both rangers could make out what appeared to be a circular area, approximately 50 feet in diameter, where the snow on the ground had melted, despite the ambient temperature being 27 degrees Fahrenheit. After approximately 5 minutes, the light ascended rapidly and rejoined the other 2 lights before all 3 disappeared simultaneously. The following morning, Rodriguez and Chen attempted to reach the clearing they had observed, but the rugged terrain made progress slow. After 3 hours of hiking, they were forced to turn back by worsening weather conditions. Chen submitted an official report to the Forest Service Regional Office on March 24, 2003, documenting the observations and including hand-drawn diagrams of the light's movements. The report was filed as Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon and forwarded to both the Tennessee Division of Forestry and the Federal Aviation Administration. Neither agency could provide an explanation. Though the FAA noted no radar contacts corresponding to the times and positions described, Rodriguez continued to document the lights throughout April, eventually compiling over 30 hours of observation notes. She also managed to capture several photographs using a camera with a telephoto lens, though the images showed only indistinct points of light against the night sky. On May 2nd, 2 researchers from the National UFO Reporting Center arrived to investigate the phenomenon. During their 5-day stay, they observed the lights on 3 occasions and measured electromagnetic fluctuations in the area that corresponded with the appearances. Their report, published in the organization's quarterly journal, concluded that the lights exhibited characteristics inconsistent with conventional aircraft or natural phenomena. The lights appeared sporadically through the summer of 2003, with the last confirmed sighting on August 17th. Rodriguez transferred to a position in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park that September, though she continued to follow up on reports from Greene County. Chen retired in 2006 and occasionally gives interviews about his experience, always maintaining a professional but puzzled demeanor. In a 2015 interview with a local newspaper, he stated, "I've spent my career observing natural phenomena and explaining them to the public. What we saw those nights in 2003 doesn't fit any category I'm familiar with. I don't know what those lights were, but I know what they weren't. They weren't flares, they weren't aircraft, and they weren't anything I could explain with 30 years of experience in the outdoors." It was October 2011 when audio technician Alan Bennett set up his recording equipment near Roanoke, Virginia. The 33-year-old sound engineer was working on a personal project to document the natural sounds of the Appalachian region for an album of ambient recordings. Bennett had spent the past year traveling throughout the mountains, capturing everything from wind through ancient pines to the calls of nocturnal wildlife. His current location was a remote valley in the Blue Ridge Mountains, approximately 10 miles from the nearest road. Bennett planned to spend 3 days recording the sounds of the area. focusing on the unique acoustics created by the surrounding rock formations. The first day of recording went smoothly. Bennett captured high-quality audio of wind, water, and wildlife, using an array of sensitive microphones connected to a digital recorder. As dusk approached, he set up his equipment to record throughout the night, hoping to capture the sounds of nocturnal animals. Bennett then retired to his small tent, exhausted from a day of hiking and equipment setup. The night was uneventful, and when he reviewed the recordings the following morning, he found nothing unusual, just the expected sounds of crickets, owls, and other nighttime creatures. The second day followed a similar pattern, with Bennett capturing various natural sounds during daylight hours. As evening approached, he noticed something odd. An unusual silence had fallen over the valley. The normal chorus of crickets and frogs was absent, creating an eerie quiet that Bennett found unsettling. He checked his equipment, confirming that everything was functioning correctly, then set up for another night of recording. Just before turning in, he heard a distant sound that he couldn't identify, something between a whistle and a hum, seemingly coming from the direction of the ridge to the east. The sound lasted approximately 30 seconds before fading away. Bennett was awakened at 2:17 a.m. by a sound that he later described as unlike anything I've ever heard. It began as a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground, then evolved into a complex series of tones and harmonics that defied simple description. Bennett rushed out of his tent and checked his recording equipment, confirming that it was capturing the phenomenon. The sound continued for approximately 7 minutes, varying in intensity and complexity before ceasing abruptly. The sudden return to silence was almost as unsettling as the sound itself. Bennett remained awake for the rest of the night, periodically checking his equipment, but hearing nothing more unusual. The following morning, Bennett packed his equipment quickly, deciding to cut his recording session short. He drove directly to his studio in Roanoke to analyze the previous night's recording. What he discovered fascinated and disturbed him. The sound contained frequencies below the range of human hearing, as well as harmonics that seemed mathematically precise rather than random. Perhaps most unsettling was what appeared to be a rhythmic pattern underlying the phenomenon. A sequence that repeated every 47 seconds with slight variations. Bennett spent weeks analyzing the recording, consulting with audio engineers, biologists, and physicists. But none could identify the source or nature of the sound. In January 2012, Bennett contacted the University of Virginia's Department of Environmental Sciences, sharing his recording and observations. Dr. Eleanor Vance, an acoustics specialist, analyzed the recording and concluded that it exhibited characteristics inconsistent with known biological or geological phenomena. In her report, dated February 14, 2012, she noted, "The recording contains harmonic relationships and frequency modulations that suggest an artificial source, though the power requirements for such a sound would be substantial, and there are no known facilities in the area capable of producing it." Vance recommended further investigation, though no funding was available for such a study. Bennett eventually included a heavily edited version of the recording on his album Appalachian Soundscapes, released in late 2012. He omitted the most unusual portions, fearing ridicule from the scientific community and the public. The full recording remains in his private archive, occasionally shared with researchers who sign non-disclosure agreements. In a 2018 interview with an audio engineering magazine, Bennett stated, "I've spent my career capturing and analyzing sounds from around the world, and I can tell you with certainty that what I recorded that night in Roanoke doesn't fit any category I'm familiar with. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't weather, and it wasn't mechanical, at least not any mechanical sound I've ever encountered." It was June 2017 when graduate student Emma Watson first visited the abandoned mining town of Helvetia, West Virginia. The 26-year-old history student was researching Appalachian ghost towns for her master's thesis, focusing on communities that had been abandoned following the decline of the coal industry in the mid-20th century. Helvetia, established in 1869 by Swiss immigrants, had once been home to over 300 people, but had been gradually abandoned after the mine closed in 1958. By 2017, only a handful of structures remained standing, preserved by the dry mountain air and relative isolation of the Randolph County location. Watson's first visit lasted 3 days, during which she photographed the remaining buildings and took notes on their condition. The town consisted of approximately 20 structures, including a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, and several residences. Most were in advanced states of decay, with collapsed roofs and vegetation growing through floorboards. Watson found the atmosphere peaceful rather than eerie, enjoying the solitude and historical significance of the place. She returned to her university in Morgantown with hundreds of photographs and pages of notes, planning a longer follow-up visit in July to conduct more detailed research. Watson returned to Helvetia on July 10, 2017, planning to spend a week camping near the town while conducting her research. She set up her tent in a clearing approximately 500 yards from the nearest building, then spent the afternoon exploring the remaining structures. As evening approached, she noticed something unusual. The door to the general store, which had been hanging from a single hinge during her previous visit, was now closed and appeared to be secured from the inside. Watson found this odd, but attributed it to either misremembering the door's previous condition or perhaps to another visitor who had closed it for some reason. The following morning, Watson discovered that several items in the general store had been rearranged. Old canned goods that had been scattered on shelves were now neatly arranged in rows, and a pile of newspapers that had been on the floor was stacked neatly on the counter. The dust on the counter showed clear handprints, though they appeared smaller than Watson's own hands. More unsettling was the discovery of fresh footprints in the dust, small bare footprints that didn't match the boots Watson was wearing. She photographed the prints and noted their location in her research journal, though she initially attributed them to the possibility of children playing in the abandoned buildings. That night, Watson was awakened by what sounded like footsteps outside her tent. She called out, assuming it might be a curious animal or perhaps another visitor to the area. The footsteps stopped, then resumed a few minutes later, this time circling her tent slowly. Watson grabbed her flashlight and peered out, but saw nothing in the darkness. The footsteps continued for approximately 20 minutes before ceasing abruptly. Watson found it difficult to return to sleep, listening intently for any further sounds, but hearing only the normal nighttime noises of the forest. The following morning, Watson discovered small, hand-shaped indentations in the dirt around her tent, as if a child had been crawling on hands and knees. The prints were too small to belong to an adult and too fresh to have been made before her arrival. More disturbingly, she found that the zipper on her tent had been partially opened from the outside, though nothing appeared to be missing from inside. Watson began to feel genuinely uneasy, questioning her decision to camp alone in such an isolated location. She spent the day documenting the evidence she had found, taking photographs and making detailed notes. On the night of July 13th, Watson experienced the most unsettling incident of her visit. She was sitting outside her tent, writing in her journal by lantern light, when she heard what sounded like a child's laughter coming from the direction of the town. The laughter seemed to move between buildings, first near the church, then the schoolhouse, then the general store. Watson called out, asking if anyone was there, but received no response other than the continuing sound of laughter. After approximately 10 minutes, The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by an unnerving silence. Watson retreated to her tent, zipping it securely and remaining awake until dawn. Watson broke camp the following morning, cutting her research trip short by 3 days. Before leaving, she made one final pass through the town, discovering that the door to the schoolhouse, which had been missing entirely during her previous visits, was now present and closed. She didn't attempt to open it, instead photographing it from a distance before leaving Helvetia for what would be the last time. Watson completed her thesis on Appalachian ghost towns, but excluded any mention of her unusual experiences at Helvetia, fearing that such accounts would undermine her academic credibility. It was September 2015 when Mark Sullivan, a 42-year-old software engineer from Atlanta, embarked on a solo hiking trip in the Cherokee National Forest of eastern Tennessee. Sullivan was an experienced outdoorsman who had been exploring the Appalachian Trail for over a decade, typically completing 1 or 2 section hikes each year. His current plan was to hike a 40-mile stretch of the trail between Watauga Lake and Roan Mountain, a journey he expected to complete in 4 days. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and mild temperatures typical of early autumn in the mountains. Sullivan began his journey on September 5th, parking his car at the Watauga Lake trailhead and setting out in the early afternoon. He made good progress, covering approximately 10 miles before setting up camp for the night near a small stream. The first day passed uneventfully, with Sullivan enjoying the solitude and natural beauty of the forest. That evening, he spoke briefly with a group of younger hikers who were heading in the opposite direction. They warned him about a bear that had been frequenting the area near Iron Mountain, though they noted it seemed more curious than aggressive. Sullivan thanked them for the information, but wasn't particularly concerned, having encountered bears numerous times during his hiking experiences. The following day, Sullivan continued his journey through increasingly remote terrain. As he approached the Iron Mountain area around mid-afternoon, he noticed what appeared to be footprints on the trail. They were larger than human prints, but didn't match the appearance of bear tracks, with an unusual shape that Sullivan couldn't identify. He photographed the prints with his phone before continuing, noting that they seemed to follow the trail in the same direction he was traveling. The weather remained clear, though Sullivan noticed an unusual silence in the forest. The normal sounds of birds and small animals were conspicuously absent. Sullivan set up camp for his second night in a small clearing near the trail. As dusk approached, he heard what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the woods nearby. He called out, assuming it might be another hiker or perhaps the bear the previous group had mentioned. The footsteps stopped, then resumed a few minutes later, circling his campsite at a distance of approximately 100 yards. Sullivan built a larger fire, hoping the light and smoke would deter any curious animals. The footsteps continued intermittently throughout the evening, always maintaining the same distance from his campsite. The most unsettling incident occurred around 11:30 p.m. Sullivan was sitting by his fire when he heard what sounded like a voice calling his name from the darkness. The voice was faint and indistinct, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Sullivan called out, asking who was there, but received no response other than the continuing sound of footsteps circling his position. The voice called his name 2 more times over the next hour, each time seeming to come from a different location. Sullivan found this particularly disturbing, as he had told no one his specific hiking plans other than a general time frame for his return. Sullivan broke camp early the following morning, abandoning his original plan to hike the full 40 miles. Instead, he decided to take a shorter trail that would return him to his car more quickly. As he was packing, he discovered that some items from his backpack had been removed and placed neatly on a nearby log. The items included his map, compass, and a small flashlight, all things that would be difficult to navigate without in the wilderness. Nothing else appeared to be missing, and Sullivan found no footprints or other signs of disturbance near his tent. The remainder of Sullivan's hike passed without incident, though he remained on high alert throughout the day. He reached his car at approximately 4 p.m. on September 7th and immediately drove to the nearest ranger station to report his experiences. The ranger on duty, 53-year-old David Miller, listened patiently to Sullivan's account before filing an official report. Miller noted that similar reports had been made over the years, though they were rare and typically involved encounters that were even more difficult to verify than Sullivan's. The report was filed under Unusual Wildlife Encounters and forwarded to the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. Sullivan returned to Atlanta the following day, cutting his vacation short by 2 days. He experienced difficulty sleeping for several weeks after his experience, and eventually sought counseling to address what his therapist diagnosed as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. In a 2018 interview with an outdoor magazine, Sullivan stated, "I've spent 20 years hiking in wilderness areas across North America, and I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and every manner of challenging weather conditions. What I experienced in the Cherokee National Forest was different. It wasn't just an encounter with something unknown. It felt personal, as if whatever was out there was specifically focused on me." It was early November of 2014 when Daniel Mitchell first noticed something unusual near his cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky. The 37-year-old wildlife photographer had purchased the remote property 6 months earlier, seeking solitude and inspiration for his work. The cabin sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road, nestled in a valley between 2 ridges covered in dense hardwood forest. Mitchell had spent his career documenting elusive wildlife in remote locations, so isolation was nothing new to him. The Appalachian autumn had painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and deep reds, creating a photographer's paradise that Mitchell had been eagerly capturing on film. The first sign of trouble came during a night photography session. Mitchell had set up his equipment to capture the Milky Way over the ridge when he heard what sounded like heavy footsteps circling his position. He assumed it was a bear or perhaps a deer moving through the undergrowth. He called out, expecting the sound to scare away any animal, but the footsteps continued at a steady pace. When he swept his flashlight across the surrounding woods, he found nothing. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves that should have revealed any creature's presence, yet Mitchell could see no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to explain the sound. He packed his equipment and returned to the cabin, dismissing the incident as his imagination playing tricks in the darkness. 3 nights later, Mitchell was developing photos in his makeshift dark room when he heard scratching at his cabin door. It wasn't the frantic clawing of an animal seeking shelter, but a deliberate, rhythmic sound. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Mitchell grabbed his rifle and approached the door slowly. The scratching stopped when he was about 5 feet away. He waited in silence for 10 minutes before daring to look through the peephole. Nothing was there. The following morning, he discovered 3 parallel scratches etched into his wooden door, too deep to have been made by any animal native to Kentucky. The scratches began at chest height and extended downward, as if something had been testing the integrity of the wood. Mitchell contacted the Harlan County Sheriff's Department on November 9th to report the incidents. Deputy Thomas Riley recorded the complaint at 2:17 p.m. and drove out to inspect the cabin. While Riley found the scratches unusual, he suggested they might have been made by a bear and advised Mitchell to keep his doors locked. That night, Mitchell set up motion-activated cameras around his property. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. At 3:42 a.m., one camera captured a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the woods, partially obscured by trees. The figure remained motionless for exactly 11 minutes before stepping back into the darkness. The image was grainy, but showed something distinctly humanoid in shape, standing at least 7 feet tall with proportions that didn't match any known animal. Mitchell packed his belongings and left the cabin that day. He contacted the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, who sent investigators to examine his photos and recordings. While they couldn't identify the figure, they found the evidence compelling enough to include in their database of unexplained sightings. Mitchell never returned to the cabin, selling it the following spring to a hunting outfitter who reported no unusual experiences. The footage Mitchell captured remains available online, analyzed by numerous experts who have reached no consensus. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department closed the case on November 30th, 2014, with a note that no further evidence was found and no additional reports were filed from the area. Mitchell occasionally gives interviews about his experience, always ending with the same statement: "I've spent 20 years in wilderness areas across North America, and I've never encountered anything that made me question my understanding of the natural world the way those 4 nights in Harlan County did." It was late October of 2019 when Ben Carter, a senior ranger with the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, was performing a final sweep of the remote Cataloochee area before the winter closures. At 52 years old, Carter had walked these trails for nearly 3 decades, knowing every switchback and ridge by heart. His task that day was to document wildlife activity near the abandoned settlement of Little Cataloochee, a place where time seemed to stand still. The air was sharp with the scent of decaying leaves and cold stone, and a persistent drizzle left a glistening sheen on the ancient, moss-covered trees. Carter moved with the practiced economy of a man who was more a part of this environment than a visitor to it. He was following an overgrown trail toward an old cemetery when he saw it. Approximately 50 yards off the trail, half concealed by a thicket of rhododendron, was a structure. It was a tower, perhaps 15 feet high, built from dark gray stone that did not match any of the native rock formations in the park. Its design was unnervingly precise, a perfect cylinder with no visible seams or mortar, as if it had been carved from a single piece of stone. Moss and lichen clung to its surface, suggesting it had been there for a very long time. Yet its geometric perfection felt utterly alien in the chaotic wilderness. Carter felt a prickle of unease, a cold realization that he was looking at something that did not belong. He had hiked this specific area dozens of times and had never seen it before. Carter approached cautiously, his hand resting on the sidearm he carried. The air around the tower was noticeably still and quiet, the normal forest sounds of birds and insects absent. He circled the structure once, noting that there were no windows, no doors, and no discernible entrance of any kind. The surface was cold to the touch and smoother than it appeared, with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration humming through the stone. Using his GPS, he marked the coordinates: 35.7428 degree N, 83.1321 degree OW. He took several photographs with his department-issued camera, the flash reflecting oddly from the damp stone, making it seem to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The longer he stood there, the stronger the feeling of being watched became, a palpable pressure that seemed to emanate from the structure itself. He radioed dispatch to report his location and the discovery, describing it as an unusual stone structure of unknown origin. The dispatcher, familiar with Carter's typically unflappable demeanor, noted the concern in his voice. Carter was advised to document his findings and return to the ranger station, with a team scheduled to investigate the following day. As he packed his gear to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the ground at the base of the tower was a single, perfectly formed footprint in the damp earth. It was not human. The print was narrow and elongated, with 4 toes and a claw-like mark at the heel. It was fresh, the edges still sharp, as if whatever made it had been standing there just moments before. Carter did not wait for the team. He hiked back to his truck with a speed that belied his years, not looking back once. The official report, filed under incident number GSMNP 19-1042, was quickly classified by the park's regional director. The follow-up expedition was canceled due to unforeseen scheduling conflicts, a bureaucratic excuse that Carter knew was a lie. When he attempted to access his own photographs from the park's server the next week, he found the files corrupted and unrecoverable. 2 months later, Carter requested a transfer to a desk position in the administration office, citing a desire for less physically demanding work. He never returned to the Catalucci section of the park. The official record of the stone tower and the strange footprint vanished, leaving only a quiet rumor among a few longtime rangers. No trace of the structure was ever found. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, particularly in the ancient mountains that stretch along the eastern seaboard. The Appalachian range has witnessed countless generations of human settlement, each leaving behind stories that defy simple explanation. From the mysterious lights of Greene County to the unexplained sounds of Roanoke, from the abandoned town of Helvetia to the remote ridges of Harlan County, these mountains harbor mysteries that persist despite our modern understanding of the world. The stories we've explored tonight represent only a fraction of the accounts documented across these ancient peaks. What connects these disparate experiences is not their specific details, but their underlying mystery. In each case, witnesses encountered something that challenged their understanding of the natural world, something that resisted easy categorization or explanation. The common threads: unusual lights, inexplicable sounds, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, suggest that whatever lies behind these phenomena is consistent enough to be recognizable, yet elusive enough to remain unexplained. Perhaps most unsettling is the fact that many of these accounts come from credible witnesses, rangers, researchers, and experienced outdoors people who have no reason to fabricate such experiences. Silence plays a significant role in many of these accounts. Not just the absence of sound, but a quality of silence that feels deliberate, as if the normal background noise of the forest has been intentionally suppressed. This phenomenon, reported by witnesses from different locations and time periods, suggests something beyond normal acoustic patterns. Perhaps it is merely a psychological response to unusual situations, the mind's way of heightening awareness in the face of potential danger. Or perhaps it represents something more fundamental, a temporary disruption of the natural order that precedes or accompanies unexplained phenomena. Memory also shapes these accounts. Human memory is notoriously fallible, yet the consistency of details across different reports lends credibility to these experiences. The precision with which witnesses recall specific times, locations, and sensory details suggests something more significant than mere imagination or misperception. These memories persist long after the experiences themselves, becoming part of the oral tradition that defines the Appalachian region. They are stories told around campfires, shared in small communities, and occasionally documented in official reports, creating a body of evidence that cannot be easily dismissed. The absence of answers defines these mysteries as much as the presence of questions. Unlike fictional horror stories, these accounts offer no neat resolutions or satisfying explanations. The witnesses we've heard from tonight did not discover the source of the lights they observed or the nature of the sounds they recorded. They encountered something unexplained, documented it as best they could, and we're left with the quiet unease that comes from knowing the world is stranger than it appears. Their stories serve as a reminder that mystery still exists, that there are places and phenomena that remain beyond the reach of our current understanding. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. These accounts, when shared and documented, form a collective record of the unexplained, a map of the strange and wonderful corners of our world. They remind us to approach the unknown not with fear, but with a sense of wonder and a respect for the limits of our knowledge. The mountains